Hi everyone, I hope you're doing really well. Welcome back to another video of counseling and virtual care. We are now looking at really interesting content in terms of counseling approaches. This week and next week we'll start looking at different theoretical aspects of how to do counseling. And in a way, hopefully this will give you enough tools to transcend or move beyond just the basic counseling skills that we've been talking about. So these ideas, these theoretical approaches will perhaps help you start thinking. You may remember when we were talking about the eclectic approach and we were sort of asking the question, which type of counselor would you like to be? So this is when we start providing you different ways of doing counseling, because so far it was all basic counseling skills that pretty much were common across the different theoretical approaches. But here we'll start giving you different ways of addressing the same problems, or I guess in a way we'll start teasing out different ideas of, for example, what is the function and role of the therapies, what are the techniques, specific techniques that you could use in each of these approaches, and what are the goals of therapy. And again, because you have different theoretical approaches, perhaps they may resonate with some aspects of how you see the world, how you believe things should be, counseling should be, and it may help you start identifying which route, direction, which type of counselor do you think you could be, and perhaps it could form the next steps of your professional career. So I hope you enjoy this content. Here we go. So far, we've been talking about basic counseling skills that will very likely be commonly applied in different contexts and by different therapists, regardless of the theoretical orientation. However, we will now start looking a bit more at the different ways of doing counseling and how these can be informed by different theoretical positions. In this video, we'll focus exclusively on person-centered therapy. This approach is being used around the world and will likely help you start moving beyond simply using your basic counseling skills that you have learned so far. Now, you may remember a few weeks back when we introduced the idea of counseling and we briefly talked about the different approaches to counseling. We talked about psychoanalysis, behaviorism, cognitivism, and humanistic or person-centered approaches. We didn't mention that then, but we also like to talk about solution-focused brief therapy and acceptance and commitment therapy. Honestly, there are many other approaches that you could look into and use in your own practice. You could be looking at, for example, Gestalt, existential therapy, schema therapy, relational therapy, and many others. However, we selected these therapeutic approaches here because of their diversity, applicability, and functionality. So what we're trying to present here is not an exhaustive list of all the therapeutic approaches you could be pursuing, but what we believe is quite useful and interesting to get you started. So let's look at person-centered approach. Person-centered therapy is a therapeutic approach rooted within the humanistic school of psychology. We call this idea humanistic because it focuses on the human characteristics and the endless possibilities associated with being. This means that we are all capable individuals and we all have positive qualities. Now, specific elements of the humanistic school of psychology include something like the importance of understanding ourselves and other people. This is crucial because a humanistic school of thought says that once we are able to understand ourselves, we can accept and respect ourselves, and then we'll be able to accept and respect others. Another important element is to acknowledge the importance of the history of an individual. This is because individuals are seen as experts in their own lives. They know better, and the professional simply helps them transition a difficult road or a difficult issue that they may bring to the counseling sessions. Now, self-development and self-actualization is another important element in the idea of humanistic school of thought. This is because the humanistic school of thought sees individuals as able to grow, to learn from their mistakes, and to have the capacity to continually improve as human beings, hence self-actualization. We can also mention the importance of recognizing healthy goals for people, as these are seen to guide the direction and efforts for growing and developing as human beings. Now, Carl Rogers found himself positioned within the humanistic school of thought because he proposed a shift away from power imbalances within the counseling processes that were taking place up until when he kind of came to prominence. This led him to develop the idea of person-centered approach. Carl Rogers' person-centered approach emphasized the importance of the client's experiential reality rather than the therapist's view of theories about the client. This aligns with a rejection for ideas of imbalance and power dynamics, where the counselor is usually seen as the expert. So this is almost a dig at one of the most, used approaches at that stage, and it was more around the psychoanalytic approach. Or there were other approaches emerging that we'll talk about in a few other videos, but they were all aligned with this idea of the therapist being the expert, the therapist knowing better. So here, Carl Rogers proposed that counselors should take a step back and allow the clients to explore their own issues in their own time, rather than looking for symptoms that may align with specific diagnoses that they, the counselors, may think they should pursue within any sort of presentation. So again, the idea is that Carl Rogers said, well, perhaps the counselor should take a step back and allow things to flow and emerge organically. He also proposed that clients can choose how to be and what meanings to live by, rather than being constrained by our unconscious. Now, I see this as a critique to the psychoanalytic approach, where the emphasis was placed on something called determinism. In other words, Freudian ideas propose that early childhood experiences marked us for the rest of our lives, hence the word determinism. So these early childhood experiences determine who we are, and that we would not have freedom to act because of this. However, PCT, or the person-centered approach, suggests that individuals may face uncertainty, but that they're not necessarily constrained by their past experiences. And again, this idea of humanistic, they always have the ability to learn and to grow, to self-develop. That is why Carl Rogers was concerned with the person and not the problem. Once more, rather than focusing on specific diagnosis, Rogers was more preoccupied with understanding the client's perspective towards the issues that brought them to sessions. And while the childhood experiences are always important, Carl Rogers wanted to place emphasis on immediate awareness of the self in the present moment, rather than focusing on the past experiences and how these may have afflicted the individual. Once more, Carl Rogers believed that the therapist should avoid being the expert and aim to interpret the client's experience for them. Alternatively, the focus should be on allowing the client to have a safe space to explore their own perspectives and understanding of their own issues. Now, Carl Rogers placed much importance on the therapeutic relationship as a healing instrument rather than specific techniques. He believed that an equal or egalitarian relationship between the client and the counselor will help the client solve their emotional issues. Carl Rogers also believed that only 3 conditions were needed to effect change on our clients. He talked about these ideas of congruence or therapist congruence, accurate empathy, and unconditionally positive regard. Let's start looking at unconditional positive regard. Now, unconditional positive regard means accepting the clients as they are. It requires the therapist to communicate a deep and genuine care for the client. This is really hard to do, but at the same time, by simply listening and tuning in with what our client are feeling, we will feel more drawn towards accepting and understanding their experience. And perhaps we will be also able to understand their behaviors and their feelings. And as a consequence, we will be more likely to accept and care for our clients. But the caring should not be possessive, or should be non-possessive, and should not be contaminated by our evaluations or judgments of the client's feelings as something that they did good or bad, or something that they're feeling is good or bad. The idea here is not to judge, it's just to simply observe, listen and accept without assessing whether the client did the right or the wrong thing. The therapist or counselor should value and warmly accept clients without placing conditions on their acceptance. The counselor simply accepts the client as they are, without strings attached or any conditions. And I really like the idea of providing unconditional acceptance, because love is often conditional. For example, our parents may say, if you study hard, I will take you to that concert you really want to go. And that inevitably instills this idea of a condition. So in a way they're saying, I will love you if, I will accept you if. In this case, if you study hard, or if you bring the grades that we're all expecting. So we want to be proud of you only if. However, the counselor deliberately removes this idea and accepts the clients with no conditions attached. This will help the client feel free to be themselves and speak their mind during the counseling process, and hopefully get to the bottom of what is afflicting them emotionally. Now, it's interesting to mention that this idea of unconditional positive regard doesn't mean approving all clients' behavior. For example, if a client talks about wanting to hurt animals or wanting to hurt other people, you can imagine that a certain sense of direction may be needed, letting the client know that hurting people is not okay. And it may be difficult for the therapist or the counselor to genuinely feel acceptance and unconditional care for that client in that particular situation. It is natural that as counselors we may struggle to unconditionally accept certain behaviors, such as the example I just gave before, for example, wanting to hurt someone. So that's something we need to keep in mind. There are some certain boundaries and certain considerations when we talk about unconditional positive regard. Now let's look at the second necessary condition for change, and this is empathy. Carl Rogers proposed empathy as a deep, imaginative identification with the client's subjective experience. I really like the word imaginative here. And I like it because it suggests that the therapist doesn't fully know what is happening for the client, but they imagine what it's like to be the client. So as therapists, we can't really fully know what is happening for them, but the idea through empathy is to imagine what it's like to live or see the world through the client's eyes. And this is different from sympathy, because the counselor doesn't feel sorry for the client, but truly tries to see the world through the client's eyes. Feeling sorry for a client or showing empathy will likely make the other person, or the client in this case, feel belittled and maybe feel less than the counselor. And this goes against all these ideas that we've been talking about in terms of the therapeutic relationship. If there is power imbalance and the counselor in a way is emphasizing that power imbalance, the client will feel that maybe threatened, maybe intimidated, and a few other things that may persuade them to close instead of open up. The idea behind empathy is that therapists will feel their way into the client's subjective world by drawing on their personal experiences. In other words, as clients feel comfortable and start opening up, the counselor can start understanding what it's like to be the client, to walk in their shoes, and to experience the world from their perspective. And that's what empathy is all about, understanding what is happening for the other. However, therapists must not lose their own separateness. Now, I like to think about this idea of separateness as something being able to in a way, maintain professional boundaries. Now, let's imagine you see a client for a few months and you become so attuned with the client's experience that it's difficult to remain objective. And maybe the client starts telling you about something really sad, and maybe that affects you emotionally. And the idea is that while it's good to experience their sadness, it's also interesting to maintain that idea of separateness. We are separate entities. We can vicariously understand their sadness, but we should be professional about it. I also like to think about this idea of separateness as countertransference. We haven't talked about countertransference so far, and we will learn more about that when we talk about the psychoanalytic perspective. But the idea is that the counselor needs to be aware of their own emotions, feelings, and potential attachment towards the client. And Carl Rogers asserts that when therapists can grasp the client's world as the client sees it and feels it, change will occur. And the client will likely expand their awareness and may be able to reach their real selves. Finally, the third condition that Carl Rogers talked about is congruence. Therapist congruence means being authentically present. This is really difficult to do because it implies that we need to be ourselves and genuinely care for our clients. But we also need to show no contradiction between our internal feelings and our outward behavior or communication. So what we feel internally and what we show to the world. Remember what we talked about in terms of body language and how other people can kind of get the message that we're trying to put out there. And if our internal message is not the same as our external message, then we're not in a congruent state. Being genuine involves self-disclosure and transparency. This is another point of difference with the psychoanalytic perspective, where the psychoanalyst will usually refrain from giving personal details. Now here, the person-centered therapy proposes that a certain level of self-disclosure is good. As a counselor, you probably don't want to overshare, but sometimes telling your clients some details about a similar experience will likely result in a higher therapist-client connection and, as a result, a more effective relationship overall. Now here we have a short video where Carl Rogers summarizes the three necessary conditions we just mentioned, and you will notice that he talks about all of the three: empathy, congruence, and unconditional positive regard, in a really concise and really nice, rounded manner. Let's watch this video.
I am very fortunate, and the client is very fortunate, if I can feel I really accept you fully just as you are. Sometimes that's very difficult. I held an interview with a young man in South Africa. I didn't know anything about him. It turned out he was an officer in the South African Army. Now, for me, that meant it meant that I stretched my empathic abilities to their very limit to try to be with him, to try to understand him, to try to be caring toward him. I didn't feel I did too well. And yet, I've learned since that interview really changed the course of his life. So I feel that if I can be genuinely understanding, try to listen not only to the words but to the meaning, trying to understand the person that's hidden within each one of us, that's helpful. If I really care about this person in an unconditional way, that's helpful. If I can really be myself in the relationship, not a professional expert, not a, quote, psychologist, not a psychotherapist, just me in that relationship, that's helpful. All those things are possible, and when they come together, that creates a very powerful climate for change, for growth, for drawing out the potential of the client.
So there you have it. That's the famous Carl Rogers. talking about some of the essence or some of the key elements of the person-centered therapy. In this case, again, he's summarizing the 3 necessary conditions we've been talking about. Now, let's look at the therapeutic goals of PCT. One of the main objectives in PCT is becoming the self that one truly is. And this involves an openness to experience, a trust in one's experience, an internal locus of control, and willingness to be in the moment. As you can imagine, this is quite difficult to do. It sounds pretty easy, but being able to become your true self and being trusting one's experience and things like that, it can be a little bit challenging. I want to highlight this idea of internal locus of control. For those of you who may not be acquainted with the concept, you've got internal and external locus of control. And the idea is that someone with internal locus of control believes they have a certain degree of control over what happens to them. For example, if you study hard, you will do well in the exam. Someone with external locus of control may think they don't have much control over what happens to them, and what happens to them is up to fate or destiny. If they study hard, probably won't have an effect on their grades or the exam, because maybe the examiner is really harsh on them. So you can see the difference between internal and external locus of control. Now, going back to what we were saying before, the thing is that many people run away from their problems by avoiding situations in which they are uncomfortable, and this usually leads to psychological ailments. So running away rather than talking about what is hurting, I guess sweeping things under the carpet, you can do it only so much, and at one stage it becomes to accumulate and leads again to psychological ailments. However, PCT proposes achieving a full experience in life, aiming to embrace who one is to live a more authentic life. Again, sounds easy, it's quite complex, but that's a key of this therapy. But while this objective sounds a little bit difficult, the idea is that the counselor should provide a climate that is conducive to unlocking the individual's actualizing tendency potential. And through the provision of that safe space, the client will ideally reach a state of congruence, or being in harmony with oneself. This implies practicing self-acceptance and integration and absence of internal conflict. Once more, on many occasions, the internal dialogue that most of us may have could tell us that we're not good enough, or that we're flawed, or that we shouldn't love ourselves, and things like that. Now, PCT proposes listening to that internal dialogue and giving it a safe space to discuss it, aiming to achieve self-acceptance. We should also mention that a PCT counselor does not set specific goals for the client, because a PCT counselor believes in an equal relationship, or this idea of egalitarianness, and the client is seen as the expert. So it only makes sense that the goals will be set by the client in collaboration with the counselor. Now let's move to the therapist's role and function. We will see that different approaches will recommend different techniques or different roles and functions. However, PCT believes that the main role and the function of the therapist is to develop a good therapeutic relationship, as this will facilitate change. So we say that PCT is based on a quality of being with, rather than techniques designed to help clients achieve change. And that is why we say that the therapist is the instrument of change rather than using specific techniques. As clients experience the therapist listening to them in an accepting way, they gradually learn how to listen and accept themselves. Because by being in a congruent state and showing acceptance and empathy, the therapist is a catalyst for change and facilitates a safe space for the client to explore aspects of their own being that remain unknown or scary for them. Through the therapist's attitudes of genuine caring, respect, acceptance, support and understanding, clients are able to loosen their defenses and move to a higher level of personal functioning. And once more, the PCT counselor rejects the role of the therapist as the authority who knows best. We mentioned that in PCT there is an equal relationship between the counselor and the client. This is based on the humanistic idea of an egalitarian relationship where the counselor is not seen as superior or as an expert on the client's issue, and where the counselor and client reveal the shared humanity and participate in a collaborative growth experience. Now let's talk about the therapeutic techniques used in PCT. The main idea in PCT is the emotional immediacy between the client and the counselor. Because Carl Rogers proposed that the therapeutic relationship was what is needed to facilitate change, we need to pay attention to the connection between the client and the counselor. If the counselor is able to unconditionally accept the client from a genuine, congruent, and empathic perspective, then the therapeutic relationship will likely lead to change in the client. Now, PCT counselors don't ask leading and probing questions. We talked about the idea of use and abuse of questions in previous videos. Well, in PCT, there is an intent of not asking any question whatsoever. This may be challenging, but that's an underlying idea proposed by Carl Rogers. Now, PCT counselors do not make interpretations of the client's behavior. This is in line with the idea of not being an expert on the client's issues. So in a way, the issues are being uncovered by both the client and the therapist together, and any interpretations or eureka moments are discovered by the client rather than being communicated by the counselor. PCT counselors do not evaluate a client's ideas or plans and do not decide for the client the length or goals of the therapy. Once more, this is discussed in collaboration with the client. PCT counselors do not assess, diagnose, create a treatment plan, use techniques, or advise the client. And you can see how this goes quite against the system implemented, for example, here in the Australian context, where a counselor or psychologist is supposed to quickly identify the issue and address it in 6 to 10 sessions. So what Carl Rogers proposed was quite revolutionary. Now let's look at some of the strengths and weaknesses associated with PCT. We can say that PCT left a really interesting legacy because it emphasized the importance of empathy in counseling and its role in facilitating change. This is relevant because in the 1940s, when Carl Rogers started applying these ideas, there was a different way of seeing the counseling context. And while empathy was seen as a relevant element, it was not considered the key ingredient for therapeutic change. In fact, the therapist's ability to identify and communicate the main issues was seen as the most relevant aspect of therapy, at that time. So we can see how revolutionary Carl Rogers' ideas were at the time and how he proposed a paradigm shift in how counseling is being or was conceptualized and how it affects the way we see counseling nowadays. Through PCT, counseling started to be used in non-clinical populations. For example, PCT proposed the usefulness of counseling with individuals who may engage in self-deprecating behavior rather than, for example, showing very severe clinical presentations of depression. We haven't talked about the extensions of PCT in this video, but, for example, Miller and Rolnick developed something called motivational interviewing as a method to help clients identify their intentions for change. And that's something that is seen as an extension of PCT and one of the benefits that nowadays all counselors can reap from Carl Rogers' legacy. Now, on the other hand, there are some limitations associated with PCT. For example, because it doesn't use any specific techniques, it is difficult to standardize the treatment, to quantify progress, and as a result, difficult to compare with other techniques to determine its usefulness. Also, there can be a tendency for practitioners to be supportive without being challenging. This is because there's so much emphasis on the collaborative relationship between the client and the counselor, and the counselor deliberately intends to provide unconditional positive regard and acceptance almost always. And in a way, counselors may shy away from challenging the client's assumptions to help them grow. For example, if someone sees themselves in negative light, the counselor could challenge that and say that they see the client as someone with intrinsic value. However, again, because there's so much emphasis on empathy and unconditional positive regard, the counselor may shy away from reflecting on that and being a little bit challenging. Finally, we can mention how it can be difficult to truly allow clients to decide on therapeutic goals on their own and follow their direction, particularly when counselors don't agree with the direction that the client is proposing. Also, we need to think about the frustration that a counselor, most likely a beginner counselor, could feel when the client systematically avoids talking about difficult issues. So you see a conundrum there, because the idea in PCT is not asking any questions, not taking charge, not taking the lead as a counselor. And you may see that the client is shying away from talking about something that is perhaps, according to the counselor, relevant or important. And then the counselor may feel a little bit frustrated and may think, well, I may want to do something slightly different. So you can see that could be framed as one of the limitations of PCT. And with that, we conclude this video. Hopefully you can take something positive out of this and implement PCT in your own practice. See you in the next video.